Welcome to Lecture 43, The Economic Challenges of 1990 to the Present. The Reagan lecture, Lecture 41, covers the economic problems of 1980 to 1990. So this will pick up where that lecture left off. Perhaps the most important of the economic changes that has happened in the last 40 years has been globalization. And that's been driven largely by technology. Technology, telecommunications, computers, networking, satellites, GPS, all of those innovations have allowed for Americans to communicate with other people around the globe in real time, do work from home, engage in electronic commerce, and to produce much more quickly and even on demand than before. So this increasing interconnectedness of the world economically, in which a company does business not just in the United States, but all around the globe and keeps track of all of its various employees through web-based activities. All of that has really been a revolution of the last 40 years. And you couldn't have achieved any of it without the technological breakthroughs that we have. But of course, this global economy becoming increasingly interconnected through the technology changes that we've seen does have its challenges, in which events across the globe have very immediate impacts somewhere else. For example, if a company figures out that it can transfer all of its operations to a market somewhere, say in India or in China, and that labor market is cheaper, a job that existed here in the United States for a person may be outsourced to where it could be done more cheaply or more efficiently, and the company can save money. And the technology facilitates that outsourcing. So for example, when I bought a laptop about, I guess 15 years ago and needed service for it, I called and my service was based out of India. Because at the time, that was a pretty good place to go for companies looking to train lower cost labor to be able to help people walk through the issues that they were seeing with their technology. So all of these global interconnected changes have dramatic impacts. Something happening on one side of the globe affects another side of the globe almost instantaneously these days, as opposed to 100 years ago when it took a long time for news to travel and for the impact of something to travel. One of the ways the United States tried to deal with this globalization was through NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. As borders are increasingly porous and goods and people are flowing across borders, the United States was finding that its position in global trade was slipping, that it was not as competitive. Labor was leaving the United States, jobs, that is, for workers, was leaving the United States, and the US was starting to see declines. This had been happening since the 70s, when US car manufacturers are starting to get beaten by Japanese car manufacturers. So in 1993, the United States joined this new world of open borders by signing an agreement to practically end or dramatically lower tariffs between Mexico, the United States, and Canada to create one giant free trade zone that would be beneficial to all of the people in North America. At the time, critics worried that jobs would be lost, and to a certain extent they were right. But as these borders shifted and changed, barriers to trade shifted and changed, it made it easier for companies to go across borders and pay cheaper labor costs. A good example might be Walmart. Walmart, as the last time I checked, was one of the single largest private employers in Mexico. even though it is from the United States. And so a lot of its business is really tied to, what happens there. But they can do that and do that efficiently and effectively thanks to the technology they have. At the same time, though, what does that do to jobs inside the United States for products? What if it's cheaper to make something in Mexico and for Walmart to sell that cheaper item there rather than import a United States-based item? Now, of course, it's not all down to economics, these kinds of exchanges, because you have to also consider culture is involved too. For example, Coca-Cola sells its products around the world, but it doesn't just sell Coca-Cola around the world. They've learned to adapt to regional markets and realize that, for example, Asian cultures like different flavors than Americans do. And some cultures prefer less sugar than Americans do. So it's not just the fact that there's like an economic barrier that's being lost or lowered, and that trade is increasing regardless of culture and other values and beliefs. But it's that this globalization is connecting the world in lots of different ways without erasing all of those local traditions and cultures and customs. So we might look at NAFTA as an example of globalization, an example of connecting the US to the rest of the world, but at the same time, it hasn't changed Mexican culture or American culture as much as we might think it does. The economic arguments against NAFTA were revitalized in 2017 after the election of President Trump, and it was renegotiated and replaced with the USMCA. I'm not going to make you or ask you to memorize what all that stands for. And one of the things that happens in the USMCA are increasing work and environmental regulations, which is a nod to this idea that lowering these borders hasn't always helped people the same. In fact, it has hurt people and in some cases hurt the environment. Because one reason that companies might move overseas is if the pollution standards are less in the other countries, they can save money while polluting that country's environment. And Americans don't know because they're not seeing toxic waste in their rivers and in their backyards. But they're buying products built and made in those foreign places where their environments are being harmed. So the USMCA, in some ways, is a nod to realizing that NAFTA, whatever its lofty ideals were, there was a need or a desire for more regulations to make sure that what was happening across borders was not hurting or unfairly privileging some groups over others. It'll be an ongoing debate and discussion about these kinds of free trade agreements, what they do locally, what they do to nations as a whole, who benefits, who wins, and who loses, and then how our cultures all play into that. At the time when NAFTA was created, lots of people said that it would boost the economy, it would actually help Americans be more competitive in the world, but a lot of workers were not so sure. They thought those jobs would go to Mexico, they'd go to other places, and after NAFTA, that's when you get the SHAFTA. Part of the debate over getting rid of the borders, trade freely around the world, globalizing, is what does that mean for American-made products? And this goes back to my comment about culture a couple slides back. This American Barbie doll here, with this made in Malaysia sign, is a comment on this idea of products for Americans, but not made in the United States. And so after NAFTA, there was a rise of a made in America, made in the USA movement, an attempt to try to get Americans to buy American, to benefit Americans. And that move even caught Ivanka Trump recently, who had to discontinue her fashion line when it was revealed that the vast majority of it was made in China. So how patriotic is it for you to make a product that's supposed to be for America first, but it's actually not made in the United States? The rules on this are a little bit convoluted. And today, the United States government recognizes products that are made in America, like totally in America, by American labor, but it also recognizes products that are made partially in America, but assembled elsewhere, or products that are made elsewhere and then assembled in the United States. Are those products American? It's worth thinking about. In your lifetimes, one of the biggest economic challenges was the 2008 housing bubble. This was a global financial collapse that initiated with wildly unregulated subprime mortgages. These were mortgages that were risky, really, really risky. Homeowners being encouraged to buy houses that they really couldn't afford. Some loan applications for houses were fabricated. The loan officer, stretched how much income you were making. And a lot of those kinds of unethical and duplicitous practices created weaknesses in the housing market. So when people started going bankrupt with these houses that they couldn't afford, it started having a trickle effect in the rest of the American economy. You lose a job, well, then you can't buy as many groceries as before. The people who owned your mortgage, they lose money. And so these subprime mortgages turned out to be a huge burden in the economy because there were so many of these weak, really, really risky mortgages. As the industry, a deregulated, unregulated industry, had gone wild in a frenzy of buying and selling. Well, the economy crashed. And that eventually resulted in lots of job losses as not just the mortgage industry started collapsing, but then people dependent on it did as well. Banking institutions that had made unwise investments in these subprime mortgages and other weak investments were actually bailed out by the United States government. The TARP bailout granted $432 billion in loans to keep these businesses afloat. At the time, that was explained to Americans as these businesses are too big to fail because if they collapse, all the people that work for them are going to lose their jobs, and we can't afford that. This led to the president at the time, the second Bush, ending his presidency with incredibly low approval ratings. Few things turn Americans against the president more quickly than an economic collapse. And so as his presidency came to an end, lots of Americans blamed Bush and they blamed Republicans for this unregulated, unethical, wild, speculative capitalism that had been unleashed in the Reagan era. And on the back of that criticism of Bush was elected America's first African-American president, a man who came into office with a message of hope, not unlike FDR, right? Promising Americans a New Deal. And his message was, I can bring hope, I can bring change. Yes, we can. Together we can do it. That president, Barack Obama, was a historic leader in terms of the decisions that he made as president, not just for his racial background. And we're going to take a look at some of those decisions in this lecture as well as some other lectures. But right off the bat, of course, the first thing he has to confront is this economic crisis. How do we get the economy going again? And not surprisingly, they turn to a New Deal style spending package. And so lots of people compared Obama to Franklin D. Roosevelt at this time. It was $831 billion of spending for building roads and other projects. It would provide jobs. It would boost the economy. They would lower some taxes to help spur investment. Largely, by June 2009, the recession was over, though it had lingering effects on into 2010, 2011. And that's because the economy is not one thing. There are lots of local, smaller economies, and they don't always respond at the same rate as the national economy does. A good example of that is Columbus, where everybody else in the housing bubble had lost their jobs and there was a widespread downturn. Columbus largely didn't have the same unemployment levels. It did pretty well. It held it together. Whereas other places across the United States saw high unemployment and didn't really recover until way after June 2009. And of course, that shapes people's perceptions of the president and what's going on. So keep in mind, economic conditions are crucial in how people see what's going on in the world around them. These graphs show what happened in 2008, 2009. You see retail sales drop off because, if you're bankrupt, you're not going to go buy stuff. Industrial production drops. Unemployment goes way up, 10%, but some places had as much as 15%. People lost confidence in the economy, and when they don't have confidence, they don't spend, they don't take out loans. Housing declines, new home sales decline. A lot of people in the aftermath said, we definitely need more regulation. We let this subprime mortgage market get way out of control, and it nearly took down all of the United States. It actually affected the entire globe. So in the wake of this, there were regulations passed to try to prevent this from happening again. In a nation where routinely we have economic collapses, 1792, 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, 1884, 1893, 1907, 1929, and 1972 to 1982. So I don't know that we will learn from our past mistakes. And of course, Obama taking his seat in the presidency was a historic moment for African Americans, but it did not solve all problems for African Americans, as many people kind of hoped that it would. Racism and other issues still persisted. Obama himself was the target of quite a number of racist attacks. His wife was called an ape in heels at one point. So, he weathered quite a storm as president of people suggesting that he be lynched, questioning his citizenship. But after 2 terms, the United States remained in a pretty well-growing economy until recently. And of course, you guys are living this right now. As the novel coronavirus is discovered in China in last fall, winter, the Chinese, of course, do severe restrictions and shutdowns. So it affects their economy. It also affects their daily lives. The United States, meanwhile, doesn't really do much until late January. The U.S. had 19 cases of COVID in January. The president didn't suspend travel to China, though, until late January. And of course, now we know the problem with this sort of late, slow response is that this virus sits in you for 12 to 14 days with no symptoms. And so you can spread it to numerous people before you even know that you have anything. By February, the U.S. has already had a death from COVID-19 and 68 cases by the end of that month. March, finally, the president declares a national emergency, which frees up disaster relief dollars to help fight the virus. Same month, states begin acting stay-at-home orders, which are called non-pharmaceutical interventions, or NPIs, to limit the spread of the disease, since we know this spreads from person to person, and you don't know if you have it. And, you can infect so many people before you even know. And because of the threat to the economy, Congress passed the CARES Act, which will use $2 trillion to bolster the U.S. economy. It will pay families up to $2,400. If you're married, filing jointly, individuals get up to $1,200, which it's an advance on next year's taxes. And it has all kinds of other monies that I'm going to show you to help keep the economy going. Confirmed COVID cases as of April the 9th, you can see the New York is leading. California is pretty high. Some southern states. Places where there's been lots of travel have been affected. Ohio has done pretty well overall. We're in the 5,000 to 10,000 range. The governor of Ohio worked swiftly to do stay-at-home orders, to suspend school, as you know, to limit contact between people. So currently, right now in Ohio, the most cases are in Cuyahoga County, which is Cleveland. Franklin County, where we are, has the second highest number of cases, about 830 something. As you can tell from the map, the coronavirus is noted in China. Cases start peaking, and then they do strict shutdowns to try to limit the spread. And you see their curve is flattening. The rest of the world is experiencing a far rising curve as they reacted a little slowly. You can see the spread here. China, there's quite a bit of evidence in February that the U.S. could have limited this, but didn't. Where that leaves us now economically is job claims are almost, this graph's actually behind now, old news. It says 3.3 million. It's now close to 10 million. You can see economic activity, manufacturing activity is on the decline. So the CARES Act, 43 billion estimated for education, 560 billion for people, public health, state and local government, small business, and big corporations, and a 26 billion safety net. So this is $2 trillion worth of spending so we can avoid an economic collapse. So as we sit inside watching Tiger King learning that Carol killed her husband, we are encouraged to wash our hands and avoid contact in the hopes that this crisis will end much sooner rather than continue.